There was a point in my ministry when I specifically felt that call to ministry where I said, Lord, why couldn't we have done this a long time ago? Because I felt like I was certain this is where I was supposed to be. This is what I was supposed to be doing. I suddenly I was filled with some kind of inner peace that I finally was doing what God designed me to do. I don't know about you, but I've had just a couple times in my life where I'm pretty sure God spoke words to me. How do you know it's God speaking? I'm not going to tell you it's easy. It's a still small voice, right? But for me, it's like these words appear in my head that I know are not my own. They're just not mine. I cannot assign those words to any other input in my life except God. And when I said to God, why couldn't we have done this in the beginning instead of waiting until now? He said, all that has come before was to prepare you for this. Now, basically what he was saying is that you weren't ready. Yeah, you weren't ready. You weren't ready for this responsibility. You weren't ready to lead a congregation. You weren't ready to preach the word. But all the stuff that happened in your life up to this point helped to prepare you to do all of that. I grew up in church. I was baptized at 6 months old. Now, you know that I grew up in a different tradition than yours. But we're not that different, not really. I grew up in Mishawaka East Methodist Church, and when I was in high school, it became United Methodist Church because the United Brethren and the Methodists came together and merged in 1968, if I remember correctly. And so I was a part of everything that happened there. I was involved in the youth group. I was involved in Sunday school. I went through confirmation classes. When I was a freshman in high school, I got to sing in the adult choir with my dad. It felt like an honor at the time. You know, I'm grown up now, and I get to sing in the adult choir. But I didn't realize that all these years later, how much that would mean to me to think back on that. And just a few years before my dad died, he lived with us and sang in the choir with me at Grant Memorial, and I got to sing in the choir again with him. Just for a short time, but it was good. I went to church camp when I was in junior high and high school, and I remember in church camp we had a commitment night. So Thursday night, you know, we received a special message, and we walked up and knelt at the altar, and we filled out these little cards that they gave us, and that was commitment night. And then we couldn't speak, you know, we had to be quiet the rest of the evening. I didn't realize, so this would have been 1966, 67, somewhere in there probably, that I did that. And a few months later, I get a card in the mail from the camping organization, and they said, congratulations on choosing to become a pastor. And I said, wait a minute. I don't remember choosing to become a pastor. What's this all about? Isn't that weird? That's weird. I had no intention of being a pastor at that point. I made a commitment to Christ, but I didn't know that it included ministry in that. Maybe it did. I graduated from high school in 1971 and went to school for a year to become a X-ray technician. Decided hospitals really weren't my thing. I really struggled with being in the hospital every day and with dealing with people that were suffering so much. And I mean, they made me take X-rays of everything, like body bags, you know. No, just no. I admire and respect all the people that can do that. It wasn't for me. Guess where pastors spend a lot of their time? Yeah, hospitals. Go figure. I thought I was getting out of that. I couldn't handle it anymore, and I went and joined the Air Force. Well, I had a little incentive, this draft card. There was a lottery in those days. Did anybody remember the lottery? Yeah, I had a really low number, like 16 or something. And I thought, and I hadn't filed the exemption that you have to file in order to be in school. Yeah, I had to do it by the first of the year of my senior year or something, which I had no clue. So I joined the Air Force, spent 4 years there. When I got out of the Air Force, I had a free ride to Purdue University. I went and did that. After I graduated, I worked at the university in their electric car laboratory there for a few years. And then I took a job with Tokheim Corporation. Some of you may have seen that name when you were filling up your car. Because for a long time, Tokheim was the primary gas pump manufacturer in the U.S., and you saw their gas pumps. They are out of business now. I didn't contribute to that, I don't think, but anyway. While I was at Tokheim, I had the opportunity to buy an airplane. I got my pilot's license when I was in the Air Force, and no, I wasn't an Air Force pilot, but they had a program there where you could be in the Aero Club, which I did, and for a very small amount of money, I was able to get my private pilot's license, and I always wanted an airplane. And so when I was at Tokheim, I bought a Cessna 150 airplane. And I flew it around the country, and I had a lot of fun with it. One day, I was asked to take a friend down to Kentucky, and I lived in northern Indiana. And so the weather was just iffy. It was just not great. And I checked the weather report, and they said it's supposed to be clearing off. So when I took off, it was marginal, but the weather report said it was going to get better. And so I flew my friend down to Kentucky, and I let him out of the airplane, and I turned around, and I looked at the fuel gauges, and I thought, I've got enough to get home. And I took off from Kentucky. Well, guess what? The weather didn't get better. The weather got worse. And the worse the weather got, I have a pilot license called VFR, which stands for Visual Flight Rules. That means if I can't see, I'm supposed to be on the ground. Unfortunately, as I was flying home, the temperature kept falling until it hit the dew point. You know what happens when the temperature hits the dew point? Clouds form. and I was in the middle of clouds, and I couldn't see. So one of the solutions that pilots use when they can't see is they climb over the top of the clouds. I pushed that throttle in, and I pulled back on the yoke, and I was determined to fly over the top of the clouds. And I climbed, and I climbed, and I climbed. Now, when I hit 10,000 feet, I was still in clouds. There's rules about flying over 10,000 feet if you're flying VFR. Because over 10,000 feet is called controlled airspace. That means you have to have a flight plan. People have to know you're there. You have to be bright and visual on their radars so that you aren't like running into airliners and things like that, which is not healthy, you know. When that didn't work, I only had one choice left, and that was to get under the cloud deck. Well, it was getting dark. It was almost completely dark by now. And I still can't see, and so I start descending and descending and descending and descending. The problem with climbing when you don't have a lot of fuel in your tank is that it uses an awful lot of fuel to climb. Are you adding up all the bad decisions here? Yeah. So, I'm low on gas. It's dark. I can't see anything, and I haven't been able to for a while. And I'm trying to get under the cloud deck. Well, it's been a long time since I set my altimeter. You set your altimeter usually when you take off to whatever the field elevation is, but things change because it's counting on the barometric pressure to stay the same. That means that my altimeter is telling me how high off the ground I am within couple, 300-400 feet. So when you get really, really close to the ground and you can't see, you won't know how close to the ground you are. And I kept going down and down and down until I should have only been a little bit above ground level. And I still couldn't see anything. Well, all of a sudden, a road sign in front of a restaurant, and I know exactly what sign it was and what restaurant it was now. I had to think about it for a while. There was this sign that showed up. I was flying at treetop level. I could have read the sign in front of the restaurant if I wasn't moving pretty fast. That was a bit of a wake-up call, but I could see. I could see a little bit. It's dark, but I could see. My gas needles had stopped bouncing a long time ago. They were just laying on the empty pins now. And I had no idea where the airfield was that I was supposed to be going to. I knew if I didn't land soon, the decision would be taken out of my hands as to where I would come down. I saw a tree line off to my right, and it was lit up by a farmer's yard light. One bright, I don't know, are they halogen or sodium or something like that, that he had in front of his barn. But it went across the field and you could see the tree line over there. And I knew that this was an empty field in front of the tree line. And so I decided, as good as it's going to get, I need to land. I put the nose over, started to descend for my landing. And I was pretty close to the ground when I saw a high tension tower, and it was right here. It was higher than me. It was just off to my left. And where there's a high tension tower, you know one thing for sure: there's high tension wires in front of you. I can honestly say I've never been more scared in my life. At one point in all of this saga, I said a prayer, and I was going to church and participating a little bit, but I can't say that I was really just devoted to my faith at that point. But I said a prayer to God, and I said, Lord, if you get me out of this one, I'll do anything you want me to do. Pretty simple prayer. Now here's the thing: don't make bargains with God. Not unless you plan on keeping them. Yeah. When I saw that high tension tower here, we don't have them up here. Boy, they're all over Indiana. Crossroads of the nation, you know. When I saw that high tension tower, I literally screamed at the top of my lungs. At the speed I'm moving, it meant I was in the wires immediately. It also meant I was past the wires immediately. And I can't tell you to this day whether I went through the wires, below the wires, whether God parted the wires for me. I have no idea. I have no idea why I didn't hit those wires. But real quickly, I was at a point where I needed to land because I'm still descending. And my plan, I turned on my landing light. My plan was when the landing light picked up the ground, I would flare. So when you land, you come down, you raise your nose, and you land that way. So when the landing light, which is a headlight on the plane, picked up the ground, I would flare. It's pitch black dark outside. The landing light never picked up the ground. I never saw it. It was a freshly plowed black earth bean field. And the dirt was as dark as the night. So I just ran into the ground with the plane. Do you know what saved me? Now, this is bizarre. Do you know what saved me? The wires. The wires saved me. When I saw that high tension tower, my natural reaction was to pull back on the yoke. I pulled back as hard as I could. And when I did, the stall warning horn went off. Because I didn't have any power on, you see. I was landing, so I didn't have any power on. And I pulled back, the stall warning horn went off, but something else happened. You know what it was? All of my speed decayed. So when I flew into the ground, I was barely moving. It bent up the propeller. The plane flipped over onto its back. I'm hanging there by my seatbelt, listening to the gyros wind down, you know. It's raining and sleeting on me. You can hear it on the plane. And I got out of the plane and walked to the farmer's house where I'd saw the light. Made a phone call for somebody to come pick me up. I shouldn't be here. You know that? I should not be here. That day in 1986, when I crashed a plane in the middle of the night in a rain sleet storm in April, it was April, I should have died. I didn't have a scratch. Now, we could call it dumb luck, right? Because it looks an awful lot like that to most people. Or maybe God was holding me to that bargain I made with him. You know? I went a few years after that accident, just participating in church, singing. Any of you know Dave Adams, by the way? You know Dave Adams? No? He's this great, big, robust guy with a huge heart that I knew at Grant Memorial. When I got done telling that story at Grant Memorial, after the service, he came up to me and he said, I only got one thing out of that sermon, out of that story is the way he said it, out of that story. I said, yeah, what's that? Don't fly with Chris. Okay. I went a few more years. I sang in church a lot and sang in choirs and did solos and a variety of things like that. And one of the things that happened when I was singing was I would always mess it up. Always. I mean, it just seemed, it got to the point where I was so discouraged I didn't feel like I should be singing in church at all because I totally, someplace along the line, I messed it up and I always walked out feeling worse than I walked in, you know? And one day I was going in to do a song and they actually had me sitting outside the sanctuary. I was supposed to walk in just when I did the song and I said a prayer. I know, novel idea. I said this prayer and I said, Lord, just help me to do a good job once, just once. I'd like to do a good job. Well, that song went better than any song I ever sang. I started thinking, maybe this prayer stuff works. Maybe I need to pray every time I sing. Of course, that's grown into maybe I need to pray every time I preach or lead a service, and I always do. I was going to a church that I had just started at, another United Methodist church, and I was just feeling closer and closer and closer to Christ, and I would sit down here in the front row, you know, because I just wanted to be as close to what was happening. It meant that I was going to a new church. I was sitting in the front row. You don't ever want to do that in a Catholic church, by the way, because you won't know when to stand up and when to sit down and when to kneel if everybody's behind you. It's terrible. No. You want to be back far enough you can figure out what's going on. But this is a Methodist church. I knew what was going on. The bad part is I never met anybody, okay, because everybody was behind me, and so I didn't really meet people, but I'd started going to the Sunday school class as well. I had a really strange morning one Sunday morning. I was walking out, and it was a long aisle, probably twice as long as this one, maybe even longer, in the center aisle. And the aisle was crowded with people leaving, and of course I was at the back of the crowd, working my way forward. And a woman stopped me. I can't tell you to this day who it was. I had no idea who it was at the time. And said to me, "Have you ever considered becoming a pastor?" This was probably 1990, somewhere in that area. Have you ever considered becoming a pastor? And I thought, that came out of left field. You know, what? Why would I hear that? I went downstairs and I went to Sunday school after that happened, and we're sitting in a circle around the table, and each of us is reading a little bit of scripture, and then we're discussing it, and it was my turn to read scripture. And when I got done reading scripture, the person sitting next to me said to me, you ought to be a pastor." Twice in one day. You got to understand, I never heard this before. Nobody ever stopped me and said these kinds of things to me. Twice in one day. When Sunday school was over, there were a bunch of people just milling around, you know, before they leave. Little groups of people talking and, you know, just normal church conversations. And I joined one of those little groups, and one of the people in that group said, "You know, you ought to be a pastor." Three times in one day. It had never happened to me before. I started considering the idea of being a pastor at that point. You never know the simplest little words that you say to somebody, what effect they might have, you know. I literally went home and I checked into seminaries where I could go to school, go to seminary. And there was one, I don't know, 30, 40 miles from me. And I enrolled. And I started seminary that fall. All you've been through before was to prepare you for this. I had a real example of that one time. We had a little boy in my church who was 7 years old and who accidentally hung himself. He was, they had bought brand new bunk beds, and this boy was bouncing on the lower bunk bed. And his head hit the upper mattress and lifted it, and when it did, there was a support wire that went across from frame piece to frame piece. When he came down, he was trapped between the mattress above and the wire below. And by the time his mother found him, he had died. We were doing the visitation at the funeral home for this little boy. And a fellow came up to me that I had not met, and he said to me, "I don't know how you do this," he said. "I've been a pastor for 30 years, and I've never had to bury a child." And it made me think. And I realized that that was the 7th child I had buried in my ministry. And then I made a connection. You see, I had a granddaughter. Her name was Abigail Joy. And she was born encephalic. Do you know what that means? It means that part of her skull was missing, and part of her brain as well. Oftentimes, people get abortions when they know that's going to happen, and my daughter didn't want to do that. She didn't agree with the idea of an abortion. So she carried Abigail full term, and Abigail was born, and she lived 5 days. And I realize that God used that experience. And that's probably why I ended up bearing so many children in my ministry. I understood what they were going through, you know? I could provide the compassion that they needed because I'd been there and I'd done that. All that has come before was in preparation for this. That's true for me personally in my ministry, but it's also true for you as a church.